You know, to really get what's happening in the headlines today, you've got to rewind the clock. And I don't just mean by a few years or decades, we're talking about millennia. The story of this land is an epic tale of faith, of empires, and of an incredible, unbreakable will to survive. So let's dive in. So you've got this small strip of land right on the Mediterranean coast that has always been, for lack of a better word, the center of the world. For empires, it was the strategic bridge connecting continents. For literally billions of people, it's the cradle of their faith. And because of those two powerful forces, it's been a flashpoint for conflict pretty much since the dawn of history. All right, so to make sense of all this, we're going to break it down into 6 pivotal moments. We'll start way back at the beginning and trace this incredible story right up to where we are today. Okay, so let's dive into our first section. The story really begins with a deep, foundational connection of the Jewish people to this land. I mean, the Old Testament tells of Abraham's journey to Canaan, the rise of the kingdom of Israel under legendary kings like David and Solomon, and of course the building of the first temple in Jerusalem, the absolute spiritual heart of the nation. But of course, this kingdom wasn't just sitting there in a vacuum, right? It was constantly caught between huge, powerful empires, which created this relentless cycle of conquest and rule. You see it with the Babylonians who came in and destroyed that first temple, then the Persians who actually allowed it to be rebuilt, followed by the Greeks, and then finally the Romans. And that brings us to a really, really critical moment, the year 70 AD. After a massive Jewish revolt, the Roman Empire just crushed the rebellion and completely destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem. This was an absolute catastrophe. It triggered what's known as the widespread Jewish diaspora, the scattering of Jewish people from their ancestral homeland, a scattering that would last for almost 2,000 years. Okay, now we're going to jump forward. A long way forward. We're talking nearly 2,000 years. That ancient religious dream of one day returning to the homeland, it was always there, woven into Jewish prayer and tradition. But in 19th century Europe, that dream started to change into something new, a modern political movement called Zionism. So what happened? What was the spark? Well, it really boils down to 3 big things. First, you've got the rise of nationalism all over Europe, this powerful idea that every people deserved their own state. Second, a just brutal wave of anti-Semitism was sweeping the continent, from violent massacres called pogroms in Russia to the infamous Dreyfus affair in France. It convinced a lot of people that they would never truly be safe in Europe. And that led directly to the third step, a guy named Theodor Herzl organizing the very first Zionist Congress to formally start campaigning for a Jewish homeland. And right after that first Congress, Theodor Herzl wrote these words in his diary, and they were basically a prophecy. It just captures the sheer determination of this new movement. And you know what? He was only off by 1 year. All right, fast forward a bit. World War I is raging, and the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled this area for centuries, is starting to crumble. When it does, the land of Palestine falls under the control of the new global superpower, Great Britain. And this moment, right here, sets the stage for a direct clash between 2 competing national movements, Jewish and Arab, in the exact same territory. And right at the heart of the conflict that's about to explode is this, well, it's a huge contradiction planted by the British themselves. In 1917, they issue something called the Balfour Declaration. On one hand, it promises to support a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. But, and this is a huge but, it also says that nothing should be done to harm the rights of the existing non-Jewish communities, who were, of course, the Arab majority. So Britain basically made conflicting promises to 2 different groups for the exact same piece of land. Now we come to the period right after World War II. After the absolute horror of the Holocaust, the push for a Jewish state becomes incredibly urgent. Britain, just unable to handle the escalating violence, basically throws up its hands and gives a problem to the newly formed United Nations. This leads directly to the pivotal moment of Israel's creation. So the UN comes up with a plan. Their solution? Let's partition the land. The 1947 partition plan proposed creating 2 separate states, one Jewish and one Arab. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan. They saw it as a critical first step, but Arab leaders rejected it completely, and that set the stage for war. So on May 14th, 1948, the moment the British are officially out, David Ben-Gurion stands up and declares the establishment of the State of Israel. I mean, can you imagine? A 2,000-year-old dream is finally real. But the celebration, it was cut short. The very next day, 5 neighboring Arab armies invaded.
For Israelis, this is their war of independence, a desperate, brutal fight for national survival against what seemed like impossible odds. But, and this is absolutely critical to understand, for Palestinians, that exact same period, that same war, is known by a very different name, the Nakba. It means the catastrophe. For them, the conflict led to the mass displacement of the Palestinian Arab population from their homes, from their villages, creating a crisis of dispossession and exile.
And the scale of this, it was just massive. The estimates are that more than 750,000 Palestinians either fled the fighting or were expelled during the war. And this isn't just a historical footnote. It creates a massive refugee crisis, whose consequences are still, to this very day, at the absolute core of this conflict. So you'd think a victory in a war for independence would lead to peace, right? Well, not here. Not even close. Israel's victory in 1948 ushered in decades defined by this repeating cycle of huge wars between Israel and its neighbors, a military occupation of Palestinian territories, and waves of Palestinian resistance. Let's just run through some of the biggest flashpoints. In 1967, you have the Six-Day War, which totally redrew the map when Israel captured the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Then in 1973, the Yom Kippur War, a surprise attack that really shattered Israel's sense of invincibility. And starting in the late 80s, you get the Intifadas, which means uprisings, widespread Palestinian resistance against the Israeli occupation. But in the middle of all this darkness, there was this incredible glimmer of hope. The 1993 Oslo Accords, symbolized by this historic handshake between Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat, led to mutual recognition. And for the first time, it actually seemed like a negotiated two-state solution might be possible. But that hope, it didn't last. The Oslo peace process fell apart because it just could not solve the toughest issues, the ones at the very heart of the conflict. What to do about Jerusalem, the constantly expanding Israeli settlements, the blockade of Gaza, and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. These weren't just political issues. They struck at the core of each side's identity. And with extremists on both sides using violence to wreck the process, trust just evaporated. The gaps were too big to bridge. And that failure, that collapse of the peace process, it pretty much brings us right up to today. It left this huge vacuum that's been filled with more conflict, more mistrust, and more suffering, all of it driven by the same unresolved problems that have defined this story for over a century. So when you strip everything else away, you see this isn't just some simple border dispute. It's a collision of two powerful, deeply felt, and competing historical narratives. For Israelis, it's a story of returning to an ancient home and the desperate, ongoing search for security after centuries of persecution. And for Palestinians, it's a story of being dispossessed of their own home and their ongoing struggle for self-determination. See, both sides genuinely believe they're on the right side of history, that they're fighting for their very survival, for justice. And that leaves all of us with the hardest question of all. In a place so layered with pain, with memory, and with these competing claims, where do you even begin to find a path to a future where both Israelis and Palestinians can finally live in peace and security?